I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too. Today we're talking about the evolution and the history of the Wicked Witch of the West. Welcome to Teacup for One. My name is Matt and I have 2 degrees, and today we are back to do a video I wasn't planning to do until this time next year in advance of Wicked Part 2, but you wanted it, you got it. We just did a deep dive into the history and evolution of Glinda, and today we are turning our attention to that distortion, that repulsion, that Wicked Witch! Take notes, Michelle. I'm just kidding. You're fantastic. We love you. Today we are going to be diving into the history of one of the most famous characters from the past century, the Wizard of Oz's Wicked Witch of the West, aka Elphaba. And much like I asked at the start of the Glinda video, how is it that a one-chapter cameo character from L. Frank Baum's original novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, has somehow become the poster child for the biggest movie of the century? Well, when we were talking about Glinda, that question had a bit of an easy answer, and honestly, it just boiled down to Billy Burke ate and left no crumbs. And Margaret Hamilton absolutely did the same. Seriously, Margaret Hamilton, also no crumbs were spared. But her performance and the portrayal of the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz is distinctly different from Glinda in a way that the movie even articulates.
Witches are old and ugly.
While MGM's Wizard of Oz film introduced the greater population to the idea of a good witch, it also depicted on screen for the first time a truly wicked witch. And it did it so well that that film's depiction of the Wicked Witch of the West has kind of become the prototype for how we imagine wicked witches, or at least how we have been imagining them for the past 85 years. You see, prior to MGM's Wizard of Oz film, we didn't see witches, well, we weren't there, but prior to MGM's Wizard of Oz film, people didn't see witches on screen all that often. There is this incredible article online by Heather Green called Representations of the Hollywood Witch pre-1939, which I'll link in the video description below. And she points out that from 1895 to 1932, there were only 10 films in Hollywood that featured witches, and those witches were never very scary. During the silent film era, witches were usually portrayed as like clown-like buffoon characters. Interestingly enough, 2 of those 10 films were actually Oz films. 1910's The Wizard of Oz and 1914's His Majesty, The Scarecrow of Oz. Both of those films feature variations of Mombi, but again, apologies to Mombi. Today we've ran out of time. Hashtag justice for Mombi. For my money, the most interesting witch portrayal during this era of silent filmmaking is from the largely forgotten 1916 film adaptation of Snow White. Now, I know this is an Oz video and not a Snow White video, but let me just say, from what I saw when I was researching for this video, the 1916 Snow White film is actually a pretty great movie. There is this entire backstory where a noblewoman makes a deal with a local witch to become young and beautiful so that she can marry the king in exchange for bringing Snow White's heart to the witch. I think the witch wants Snow White's heart so that she can give herself beautiful, nicer hair or something. But what I find really interesting about this movie is that it's a feature-length film, and the witch exists as a looming presence from start to finish, kind of similar to the role that the Wicked Witch of the West would eventually go on to play in MGM's Wizard of Oz. And this witch is constantly checking in. It's almost like she's the Mephistopheles to the evil queen's Faust. And all the while, she is dressed like what we would today consider to be a classic witch. She has a pointy hat, she's got a black dress, she's got a broom. People don't really talk about this movie, but its influence on witch portrayal in Hollywood cannot be overstated, if only because it had a major influence on one person, Walter Elias Disney. Yeah, Walt Disney saw this film when he was only 15 years old. That was actually probably when it first came out. And it had such an influence on him that it's the reason, or at least in part, one of the reasons that he decided to make his first feature-length film based around the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And as we all know, that movie was a smash hit. That movie changed cinema forever in more ways than one, and the financial success of Snow White is reportedly what motivated MGM to produce their own fantasy film, thus, getting them to purchase the rights to The Wizard of Oz. And MGM famously almost took inspiration from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs when it came to their portrayal of the Wicked Witch of the West. Now remember, in the 1930s, witches had barely been portrayed on screen at all. And Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Disney version, did something unprecedented by giving us a witch unlike any seen before by portraying her as a femme fatale. Femme fatale. Anyway, a beautiful, mysterious, and deadly woman, akin to the screen icons of the time, like Joan Crawford, and likely taking direct inspiration from a character in the 1935 film, She. And when I say likely took inspiration, I mean they pretty well took the character of She Who Must Be Obeyed from the movie She, animated her, and called it a day. Anyway, when you consider that witches are, in part, a manifestation of society's fear of empowered women, it kind of feels like a no-brainer to pair them with the femme fatale archetype, which was born out of the same anxiety. There is probably a whole separate essay that could be written on that cross-section, but we're not here to talk about that today. We're here to talk about witches! So, back to the Snow White witch. Of course, we all know that character famously transforms herself into like a more traditional, older, haggard, witch-like character. But the character design for the witch in her evil queen era, pre-transformation, that was a serious stroke of genius. And I think it's one of the reasons that Snow White, Disney Snow White, has aged so beautifully, because it stylized 1930s glamour through the lens of a fairy tale villain. Now yes, by 1937 you had the odd witch on screen every now and then, but none of them captivated audiences the same way as the evil queen. So, when production began on MGM's Wizard of Oz, Academy Award winner Gale Sondergaard was cast as the Wicked Witch of the West in an attempt to ride the coattails of the success of Disney's Evil Queen. Sondergaard was a classically trained performer who had just made history as the first ever winner for the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for her role in Anthony Adverse. She built her career on the type of sultry, femme fatale roles that inspired the evil queen in Snow White. So if they had gone in that direction for the Wicked Witch of the West, Gale Sondergaard would have been the chef's kiss perfect choice. Just look for yourself. These are some of the test photos that were taken during wardrobe tests for Sondergaard in that, sultry Wicked Witch look. Sidebar. Some people have actually speculated that Cynthia Erivo paid homage to this Gale Sondergaard witch look during her lie detector test video for Vogue. I can kind of see it, and if so, respect to Cynthia. Actually, even if not, respect to Cynthia. However, Gale Sondergaard also did makeup tests for a more traditional, ugly-looking witch. Because remember, as stylish and cool as the femme fatale witch was in Snow White, that was a character who was driven by beauty and vanity. That look was essential to the narrative. Meanwhile, the screenplay for Wizard of Oz was starting to build a contrast between good witches and wicked witches, and it would eventually have that iconic line,
"Only bad witches are ugly."
So, they eventually decided to go against the glamorous witch look, and in doing so, they lost Gale Sondergaard, who famously claimed years later, "In those days I was not about to make myself ugly for any motion picture. I have no regrets. Absolutely no regrets." And now, before we move on, I want to make two observations about the Gale Sondergaard in her, big air quote, ugly witch look. First, I don't think she looks the least bit ugly. I think she looks like a regular, above average looking human person. So there's that. But also, is it just me? Secondly, is it just me? Or does anyone else feel like the moment this photo was taken was the moment she decided she was walking off the project? That's my headcanon for this picture. Anyway, MGM's loss ended up being all of our gain, because had Sondergaard stayed on the project, truthfully, I'm not convinced we would have Wicked today. I'm not convinced witches would even exist in pop culture the way that they do today, because she ended up being replaced by one of the greatest character actors of all time, who gave one of the greatest film performances of all time. And yes, I do genuinely believe that. Fight me on it if you want to. I am, of course, talking about Margaret Hamilton. Oh, but, I've gotten ahead of myself. Before we get to the absolute legend that is Margaret Hamilton, I think we need to turn back the clock of the time dragon to where it all began. L. Frank Baum's 1900 novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Now, it's important to note, if you haven't read Baum's original novel, The Wicked Witch of the West might come off as virtually unrecognizable to you. She's portrayed as having only a single eye, she's not green. So many of the things that we think of when we think of The Wicked Witch of the West, have been informed by MGM's film as well as Wicked now by association. But in the grand scheme of the Oz books, we're talking the books exclusively here, the Wicked Witch of the West isn't actually that important. L. Frank Baum wrote 14 Oz books, and the Wicked Witch of the West, she gets one chapter in the very first book, and she's barely mentioned post-melting, if she's mentioned at all. I haven't read all 14 books. The main villain in the Oz franchise is actually a cute little garden gnome. Okay, fine, he's not cute, he's not garden, but he is Nome. The main villain in the Oz book series is the evil Nome King. In Oz lore, the gnomes are rock fairies. They live below the ground and they toil away at creating gold and silver and gems. And they resent the people who live above the surface for stealing their stuff. Honestly, fair. But the Nome King also, kidnaps people. He turns them into ornaments. That's not cool. And this is my hot take. In some ways, the Nome King is a more compelling villain than the Wicked Witch of the West. Yeah, I said it. Unlike the Wicked Witch of the West, the Oz books delve into the Nome King's motivations for his villainy, and as the books progress, those motivations change from greed to an outright need for revenge. He has more of a developed character as opposed to the Wicked Witch of the West, who's portrayed as more of an idea, but we'll get to that in a second. The Nome King is portrayed beautifully in the 80s cult classic Return to Oz, and in some ways, that movie's portrayal of the Nome King examines the same themes as Wicked, just insofar as looking at wickedness as a point of view. Sure, the Nome King does some questionable things, but is the Nome King really wrong for wanting the emeralds back from the Emerald City that were stolen from his kingdom to begin with? There's a lot to ponder, there's a lot to discuss there, and I find that really engaging, It's all in which label is able to persist. But that said, the Wicked Witch of the West in the novel has zero moral ambiguity. She is the outright embodiment of evil. And there is an argument to be made that the witch, as she's portrayed in the book, is the embodiment of the very real evil of slavery. Now, L. Frank Baum was born in 1856, so he was around 9 or 10 years old during abolition, and he grew up during the Reconstruction era. With that in mind, it makes sense that he chose to portray the Wicked Witch of the West as a slave owner. She is someone who collects different groups of people and animals solely to do her bidding. And I want to make it clear that the Wicked Witch of the West being interpreted as a slave owner, it's not just my interpretation. The word slave is used 8 times in the Wicked Witch of the West chapter, and multiple characters discuss and acknowledge the fact that she captures people with the intention of using them as her slaves. She controls a pack of wolves, she controls a swarm of bees, a flock of flying monkeys, and the entire population of Winkies. And when she captures Dorothy, there's a passage I find really interesting. A passage that I think perfectly captures Baum's intention with that character. The witch looked down at Dorothy's feet, and seeing the silver shoes began to tremble with fear, for she knew what a powerful charm belonged to them. At first, the witch was tempted to run from Dorothy, but she happened to look into the child's eyes, and saw how simple the soul behind them was, and that the little girl did not know of the wonderful power the silver shoes gave her. So the wicked witch laughed to herself and thought, "I can still make her my slave, for she does not know how to use her power." And that's what she does. She forces Dorothy to act as her servant, and she uses empty threats to scare Dorothy into submission because Dorothy does not recognize her own power. Eventually, the witch successfully steals one of Dorothy's silver slippers, and then, in an act of pure pettiness, Dorothy throws a bucket of water on her, and that is when the witch, to quote the book, melts away like brown sugar while crying, "I have been wicked in my day, but never thought a little girl like you would ever be able to melt me and end my wicked deeds." And I love that. Okay? Dorothy had access to literal magic that could have defeated the witch, but she didn't need it. And there is something so powerful about this idea that a corrupt, oppressive leader will use fear tactics to scare people into submission before they can realize they have the power to stand up for themselves, and before they can realize how weak their oppressor actually is. Melt away like sugar. Now, as far as I know, and I didn't actually dig too deep into all the Oz adaptations, so I'm fully prepared to be proven wrong on this. But as far as I know, this version of the Wicked Witch of the West's melting scene has never been portrayed on screen. And I mean, I get it. When it comes to the melting scene, it is a lot more interesting in a filmic context to amp up the stakes and have Dorothy throw water in an effort to save one of her friends who's going to die via fire, you know, rather than just standing up for herself and throwing water on the witch because she's mad at her. But that said, there is one adaptation of The Wizard of Oz that really understands and embraces like the witch's character, her original role as a tyrannical oppressor. And that is, surprise, surprise, The Wiz. Like we discussed in the Evolution of Glinda video, The Wiz is the most book-accurate adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, unless you count Muppet Wizard of Oz, which I absolutely do not. The Wiz keeps all four witches intact, and when it comes to the Wicked Witch of the West, she's been reimagined as a character named Evillene. The role was originated on Broadway by Mabel King, who reprised her role in the film to absolute evil perfection. And even though the context for the melting scene in The Wiz has been Hollywoodified, The Wiz is still one of the only adaptations that really turns attention to the freedom of the people who were suffering under the rule of the Wicked Witch of the West. Now sure, in the MGM film, the Winkies do celebrate that the Wicked Witch of the West is dead. You know, hail to Dorothy, the Wicked Witch is dead, hail, hail to Dorothy. But the weight of what that truly means for their community is kind of glossed over. You know, in the book, after the witch melts, Baum writes, "There was great rejoicing amongst the Winkies, for they had been made to work hard during many years for the Wicked Witch, who had always treated them with great cruelty. They kept this day as a holiday then and ever after, and spent the time in feasting and dancing." And this is expressed in The Wiz through one of the best ensemble numbers in the entire show, Brand New Day. Brand New Day. And of course, this song of hope and freedom and this moment in the story holds even more weight when you consider that The Wiz is a celebration of Black culture and the African American experience told through the story of The Wizard of Oz. The musical was written shortly after the Civil Rights Movement, and you can even hear Nipsey Russell quote Martin Luther King during Brand New Day in the film adaptation of The Wiz when he throws in a "free at last."
Always knew that we'd be free somehow. Free at last.
Evillene has been portrayed by a number of great artists over the years, including Mary J. Blige in The Wiz Live, as well as Melody Betts in the most recent Broadway revival of The Wiz, where she also played Auntie M. And that piece of double casting fascinates me. Now, obviously, having counterparts between people in like Kansas or the real world and Oz, you know, in terms of Oz adaptations, that is nothing new. But traditionally, Aunt M doesn't have a counterpart, or if she does, it's usually Glinda. But I mean, double casting Aunt M with the Wicked Witch, that is a bold move. If you want some insight into how Evillene parallels Auntie M, I am once again going to plug everyone's favorite Oz podcast, Down the Yellow Brick Pod. They did this great interview earlier this year with Melody Betts as well as Allison K. Daniel, and they discussed this casting choice with Melody, and Melody's insights into it are brilliant. Everyone on that podcast in that episode is brilliant. Just go. Give it a listen. Witches in Baum's Oz are their own special breed of magic wielders. Magic users. They sort of exist in their own mythology rather than playing into the witch stereotypes that people may have been familiar with at the time the novel was written. The Wiz is, again, the only mainstream Wizard of Oz adaptation that really draws inspiration for how it portrays the witches from Baum's novel. The vast majority of all other Oz adaptations have taken inspiration from the MGM film and Margaret Hamilton. And I think it's time we talk about Margaret Hamilton. Maggie Hams, the legend. Margaret Hamilton. She was born in Cleveland, Ohio on December 9th, 1902. She worked as a kindergarten teacher before turning her attention to acting in the early 1930s. She made her Broadway debut in 1932 in a play called Another Language, and roughly a year later she began her career in Hollywood when she reprised her role in the film adaptation of Another Language. And Margaret did very well in Hollywood. She played a number of supporting roles that she would later describe as women with a heart of gold and a corset of steel. And not only was Margaret talented, she was just very smart with how she managed her career. She made a point of not signing a contract with any one studio in order to avoid being pigeonholed into one type of character, and she also set her weekly rate at $1,000 per week, which was apparently low at the time. For some context, Ray Bolger and Jack Haley reportedly made $3,000 per week on the set of The Wizard of Oz. Margaret also negotiated a minimum of 6 weeks of work for herself on The Wizard of Oz, even though she ended up working on the film for roughly 3 months. Very difficult 3 months, but we won't get into that right now. Anyway, this was an actor who knew her worth, and she delivered an incredible performance with only 12 minutes of screen time. And she made such an impact. Allegedly, she did shoot more, but kids in test audiences were so scared of her that it had to be reduced to the 12 minutes we have now. And the rest of the footage is probably lost hanging out with the jitterbug, whoever has the jitterbug footage. I know you're out there. If you're watching this, please give it to us or just let me see it. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, I think the reason The Wicked Witch of the West is so terrifying is because Margaret is so present as an actor. Everyone else Dorothy interacts with in Oz sort of talks to her like they're telling a bedtime story to a little kid. It's almost like they're talking at her instead of talking to her. But the witch is always talking to Dorothy. And I think that groundedness and that presence is what makes her so captivating and so scary. But, in addition to Margaret's performance, The Wizard of Oz was one of the first times that a wicked witch had been fully realized on screen. The idea of an evil witch and what that looks like would have been in the public consciousness, you know, pointy hat, broom, etc., etc. But this was the first time a single character was pulling it all together on the silver screen. And because for so many of us, The Wicked Witch of the West was our first introduction to witches, it's difficult to imagine or differentiate what existed before the movie and what was informed by the movie, just in terms of our idea now of what makes a wicked witch. There are a few iconic components to her look. Some of these things existed in witch lore before the film, and some of them came about because of the film. First, let's discuss the pointy hat. I have actually wondered for years whether or not the pointy hat was associated with witches before The Wizard of Oz, or, you know, if it's one of those things that came about because of The Wizard of Oz. But for some reason I never thought to actually look it up before researching for this video. But I can confirm, witches and pointy hats were a thing long before 1939. But that said, the origin of the pointy hat in relation to witches is still widely disputed. Lots of people say that it was born out of anti-Semitism, which honestly tracks, because there's a long and unfortunate history of Jewish stereotypes influencing how witches have been depicted, ranging from the stereotypical pronounced nose to more modern examples like almost literally all of Roald Dahl's The Witches. But when it comes to the hat specifically, in 1215, the Pope issued a ruling that said Jewish people would have to wear a pointed cap known as a Judenhut as a means of distinguishing them from Christians. And because people are the way that they are and the way that they always have been, eventually the anti-Semitic art that was already being produced started to incorporate the pointed hat in association with people practicing evil and coercing with the devil. That said, the style of hat does differ from the traditional pointed witch hat, which has had some people question whether or not there is actually a relation between the Judenhut and the witch hat. It's also worth noting that roughly 200 years later, in the 1400s, there was a decree passed in Hungary that mandated all first-time offenders who were caught practicing sorcery would have to wear a pointed hat as an identifier. Some other folks attribute the origin of the witch hat to the hats worn by Quakers who were vilified by the Puritans in the 18th century because they questioned social and religious norms and were therefore associated with witchcraft. But once again, that hat wasn't a perfect match for, you know, the witch hat. There is also a theory that the witch hat, as well as a few other witchy tropes like brooms and cauldrons, evolved from women who brewed and sold beer. These women were known as alewives, and they would occasionally wear pointed hats to get attention from people in the marketplace. Unfortunately, they also got attention as women who were financially independent and self-sufficient, and it's a tale as old as time. When you get a woman who's like that, she's automatically accused of witchcraft. Seriously, a woman can't even make beer without being called a witch. So, suffice it to say, there is no definitive answer as to where or how the pointy hat came to be associated with witchcraft, but by the 1700s it was a common enough image that it began to appear in children's books associated with witches, and the rest is history. But whatever the origin, All of these theories have one thing in common. In all of these examples, the pointed hat always acts as a signifier, meant to identify a group of people being othered and vilified. And that's just par for the course when it comes to witches. Pretty well any time you have a story about a witch, you'll have a backstory involving a person or a group of people who are feared for their differences, their independence, or their general defiance of the cultural norms. That is also strongly tied to another one of the Wicked Witch of the West's iconic tools, her broomstick. Broomsticks have been associated with witches for hundreds of years, with the first depiction of a woman flying on a broom dating back to an illustration from 1451 from a publication of a lengthy French poem called, pardon my French, I'm Canadian but a very bad one. The poem was called La Championne des Dames, the defender of ladies. The poem condemned misogynistic beliefs about women that were prevalent in medieval society and called out witchcraft as a result of these prejudices. I don't think the poem actually discusses witches flying, but the idea of witches flying wasn't very far off, because just a few years later, a notorious witch-hunting manual called the Malleus Maleficarium was published, which claimed that witches had the ability to fly because of an association with the devil. There is also a fair bit of fascinating, albeit X-rated history and theory surrounding the whole idea of witches riding a broom and broomsticks and their association with women and witchcraft in general, but we won't get into that right now. Suffice it to say, it involves hallucinogenics, the broomstick as an icon of domesticity, contrasting with its very specific shape, and once again, it all boils down to the empowerment of women posing a threat to men. So, when it comes to MGM's Wicked Witch of the West, the pointed hat and broomstick were already well-established icons associated with witchcraft. What the movie added was making the choice to portray the witch as a froggy, ferny cabbage, you know, the baby is unnaturally green. Yeah, the green skin. It's time to talk about the green skin of the Wicked Witch of the West. Yes, the green-skinned witch was a total invention of the MGM film. The choice was likely made in an effort to take full advantage of Technicolor. You know, that's the same reason that the silver slippers were changed into ruby slippers. It's a very colorful movie. They wanted to show off color. However, Margaret Hamilton also stated that the green was selected in part because her all-black costume was photographing oddly against her natural skin tone. It was creating like this visually separating line that looked unnatural, and that issue did not apply against the right shade of green. But whatever the reason, the green skin was a bold choice that paid off and became as ingrained in our modern idea of witches as the pointy hat and as riding the broomsticks. And over the past 10 to 20 years, the green skin has really taken on a life of its own as the Wizard of Oz has continued to be revisited and reinvented. I think the three most prominent examples of the green skin in relation to the Wicked Witch are Wicked,
You're green. I am.
alongside Oz the Great and Powerful, and ABC's fever dream of a TV show, Once Upon a Time. Now, it's important to note that none of these adaptations exist in the same universe as MGM's Wizard of Oz. They legally cannot. My understanding is that the Margaret Hamilton witch is a specific and very likely trademarked shade of green that cannot be used without getting permission from Warner Brothers and probably paying them a lot of money. But I think that only applies to that one specific shade of green, because even though the MGM film introduced the idea of a green witch, they don't own the idea of a green witch. And because the Wizard of Oz novel is in the public domain, it has started this trend of Oz adaptations that give an origin story to the Wicked Witch of the West's green skin. We'll get to Wicked in a moment. First, I want to talk about Oz the Great and Powerful as well as Once Upon a Time, because their backstories for the Witch of the West have something in common. In Oz the Great and Powerful, West Witch is introduced as Theodora the Good, a magical young woman who does not realize she's being emotionally manipulated by her evil older sister. After having her heart broken by the wizard, she's offered a magical apple that she's told will subside her heartbreak, but in actuality, it just shrinks her heart and turns her evil. And in doing so, she undergoes a physical transformation and becomes green and hideous.
Sister, you're hideous.
In Once Upon a Time, Zelena is also portrayed as a relatively insecure character who has the capacity for good. However, she is extremely susceptible to envy. As her story progresses, she allows her envy of others to overtake her. The envy begins to manifest as green skin, and she becomes green. See, in both of these cases, the green skin is portrayed as the byproduct of some kind of transformation, a signifier that the character has descended past the point of no return and they've embraced wickedness. And in doing so, their physical appearance is altered. When it comes to Wicked, both the book and the musical, Elphaba is born green, and this is so significant because she is a character who is born different, and those differences are, in part, what eventually caused society to label her as wicked. Gregory Maguire's vision for Elphaba, as depicted in the book and later reimagined for the musical, is absolutely brilliant because she embodies so many of the human qualities that have been wrongly construed as witchcraft for centuries. And it all starts in the first chunk of the book, which outlines Elphaba's birth. She is the first daughter of an extremely religious minister, calling back to the age-old tensions between church and magic. And I'm not sure if this was intentional, but in the novel, Gregory Maguire kind of parallels Elphaba with one of Shakespeare's most infamous villains, Richard III. In Henry VI Part 3, Richard recounts his childhood and claims, "The midwife wondered and the women cried, 'O Jesus, bless us, he is born with teeth.' And so I was, which plainly signified that I should snarl and bite and play the dog. Then, since the heavens have shaped my body so, let hell make crooked my mind to answer it." Like Richard III, in the novel, Elphaba is born with teeth. In fact, she bites off her midwife's finger just within a few minutes of being born. And this calls to mind the very outdated stigma surrounding babies born with natal teeth as being people who are destined for evil. Now, admittedly, Elphaba is not nearly as aggressive or corrupt as Richard III. Richard III claims that he was born in such a way that the world saw him as a villain, and so he resolved to live his life as a villain. Elphaba's journey is slower and far more tragic. She has good intentions, but between being othered because of her appearance and ostracized for questioning authority, she eventually turns to anarchy and becomes the wicked witch that people always saw her as anyway, because after all, no good deed goes unpunished. That's what No Good Deed is about, I think. I don't know. So anyway, let's call back to that question I asked at the start of the video. Why has the Wicked Witch of the West persisted as such an iconic character when she started just as a one cameo character in L. Frank Baum's original novel? I think it's because she has come to represent the long, painful, beautiful history of witches. And in terms of the endearing appeal of Elphaba, if the Wicked Witch of the West represents the vilification of powerful and outcast women, then Elphaba represents what happens when that power is reclaimed. She is a person who is labeled as a wicked witch who turns attention back to the problems and the evils of the society that labeled her as a wicked witch in the first place. And even though I haven't seen the film yet, Cynthia Erivo really seems to have this deep and nuanced understanding of Elphaba from this angle. She has spoken in depth in all of her interviews about the very clear vision she had for the character, ranging from design choices like Elphaba having micro braids and freckles, to Elphaba's nails as a physical manifestation of Elphaba's growing power, to finding empowerment in her solo dance sequence during the Ozdust ballroom scene. All in all, I am so excited to see how her version of Elphaba changes the course for how we think of the Wicked Witch of the West going forward into the future. She is the perfect person to carry the torch and continue the legacy of this character. I am so excited for November 20. I am so excited to see this movie. Okay, friends, with that, where'd my cup go? Alright friends, with that, this concludes yet another episode of Teacup for One. Now let me know in the comment section down below, what is your favorite portrayal of the Wicked Witch of the West? And are you excited for Wicked? Because I know I am. And if you want to be the first to know when I post more videos talking about Wicked, Wizard of Oz, witches, Disney, Shakespeare, cats, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. And if you haven't subscribed already, it is so easy. All you have to do is click on my face. Thanks for joining me today, everyone. My name is Matt, and I have 2 degrees, and that's the tea cup for one. I think I'll try defying gravity. I'll leave it to Cynthia, Erivo.